about what is it we're already doing, how do we build on that, what are the different roles and responsibilities that we all hold, what possibilities are there in terms of being more proactive. In particular, I remember a comment last time saying that if we could find a way to make more resources, more tools available to people sooner, that would be really helpful in a number of cases. So what are those triggers? What are those markers that we need to be on the lookout for as we think about what's possible moving forward? So today our agenda should be posted online and around the room for all to take a look at as I run through it. But I want to just start with another round of introductions with the task force members, just to have them have a chance to say hello, anything that they'd like to share that's happened since we last met last month. And then we are going to get into the business of the Drought Water Supply Advisory Committee, get an update from Troy Blanford, stream flow conditions from Aaron Fischetti at USGS, drought outlook from Michael Downey on the DNRC team, and then time for questions and discussion with everyone online and members around the room here. We'll then pause and take a quick break. I think one of the lessons of last month was we tried to do too much over 2.5 hours and didn't take a pause. So we're going to take a quick beat between the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee meeting and the task force discussion. We'll start with just a review of where we are in the planning process and the progress that we've made in the last month and how that's continuing to build upon previous actions. We'll then get into the conversation that is really the focus of today, thinking about what are those response actions and recommendations that we want to bring forward to help inform the development of the plan. And then thinking specifically about the connection between DWSAC, the Water Supply and Advisory Committee, and this Drought Task Force. Is there an ongoing role that we want to start talking about now so that we're thinking about any changes that might need to be made in terms of role, statute, et cetera. And then we'll try to wrap up by 12:30. Any questions before we jump in? All right, I'm just going to go ahead and have members of the task force go ahead and say good morning, introduce themselves, and if there's any updates you'd like to share since our last meeting. I'm going to go down my list here, which has Ian Foley at the top. So,
good morning, everyone. Ian Foley, Department of Agriculture, Ag Sciences Administrator. I guess just real briefly, it's pretty inconsistent out there from an ag perspective. Hard to paint a consistent picture. I was up in Havre last week, 2 weeks ago. It had greened up a little bit, but they're still 3 inches behind, I think, on their water year precip. Some of the winter crops looked pretty good going up there. Winter canola looks good from Great Falls to Havre. So there's some bright spots for sure. On the sales side, I think our small grain assessments, so basically what producers are selling to elevators on a daily, monthly basis, are essentially nothing at this point. Bins are all scraped dry. We had some 2018 crops going through the state grain lab in Great Falls, so producers really do need some yields here coming up quick to capitalize on prices. So it's a pretty inconsistent picture out there.
yeah, thanks, Ian. Really appreciate that perspective from Department of Ag and just the look across the state. It's really consistent with what we're hearing from other folks as well. I think Cody Ferguson just jumped on. Cody, do you want to say good morning and any updates from your perspective?
Sure. Yep. Cody Ferguson, Community Planning Program Manager with Montana Department of Commerce. I don't know. I have many updates. We've all been kind of organized to respond to the flooding in terms of kind of, pointing whatever resources we have to respond to that, the damages to businesses and homes, and kind of, working with the governor's office to come up with whatever solutions we can. But beyond that, I don't know that I have any big updates from our last meeting. It's been busy in lots of other directions lately.
Yeah, no, certainly appreciate that, Cody. Thanks for taking the time to be here and saying a quick morning to everyone. And Eric Drum, you're going to speak on behalf of Galen this morning.
Yep. So Eric Drum, filling in for Galen Steffens with the Department of Environmental Quality, Water Quality Planning Bureau. Again, like Cody, DEQ's been dealing with a lot of effects of the flooding, specifically to wastewater treatment plants and drinking water facilities. A lot of those issues are beginning to be resolved. So moving on that, within our bureau, we're starting to get some harmful algae bloom reports, somewhat associated here with drought. And then, yeah, I think that's about it related to drought on our side.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Yeah, I appreciate everyone. I'm just putting you on the spot with quick top of mind updates, but it's great to hear what's happening across the departments and bureaus and really thinking about those intersections between water management, drought, and everything in between. Stephen Bagley, morning.
Hey, good morning. Stephen Bagley, Montana Department of Fish, Life, and Parks. As far as some of the updates we had our last commission meeting was approved to move forward with amending an administrative rule with regard to our drought closures, water restrictor, drought closures, and fishing restrictions, specifically looking at criteria for West Low cutthroat trout and that temperature criteria that we have established there. I think there was a pretty good discussion, and there was approval to go ahead and move forward with that. So that'll be making its way through the administrative rule making process. On the other in terms of your update regards to our drought response, we did go through a fairly comprehensive process just in the water program, because we were looking at early on, as far as where the conditions were looking like back in March, April, really kind of concerned about what flows we're going to do and where we will be in terms of protecting our in-stream flow water rights. And so we went and we did a pretty comprehensive review looking at many of those streams that we have a tendency to regularly make call on, through, during times of drought. And in doing so, we kind of were able to produce more of a formalized, document. The process was, as I kind of mentioned before, we had a process, but it was fairly informal. This one is a little bit more formal. It's more direct in terms of how the agency assesses where we make a call, who is to be called, and so on. And that process, I think, was a very useful one, with regard to our program. So it is in the process of being finalized currently now. There are meetings with both the director's office, governor's office, and that. As many of you may recall, last year we had some concerns about our response with regards to making call on the Smith and Shields, and that's what kind of prompted this analysis and assessment, and as well as kind of formalizing that process. So great.
Great. Thanks for the update. Really appreciate it. Mike Honeycutt, I believe you're online, Department of Livestock.
Yes, thank you, Sean. Good morning, everybody. No real updates other than, things that people have already said. There is a little more positivity on the forage front, I guess, in most areas of the state, thanks to the rains we've had here in recent months, with the exception of right up along the Rocky Mountain front. Just was talking to a producer this morning, still some tough conditions in that area north of Great Falls. But I apologize. I'm not able to be there with you in person today, and I'm actually going to have to jump off here early. I have some guests and other things coming in here a little bit later this morning. So apologize that I'm a little bit overbooked, but I'll stay on as long as I can. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for joining, Mike. I know it's a busy time. Just want to check. I don't think Jake Gagne is with us this morning, but Jake or someone from Emergency Services? All right, so we'll go to Department of Natural Resources Conservation. We've got Anna Packham-Stevenson in the room. Director Castor is online, so I'm not sure which of you would like to say.
I'll start and then see if Amanda wants to say anything as well.
Great.
Welcome. Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. Just a couple updates around water. Obviously, like the other agencies, we've been all flooding all the time in strong coordination with DES and FEMA, and just want to kind of give a shout out to our Water Operations Bureau and the community coordination and collaboration and the support that they're working with local communities on, and our Water Management Bureau doing monitoring and information gathering around the flooding. In addition, the Stream Gauge Working Group, just want to thank, that's a subgroup of this group. They've done a lot of work, and in particular, Paul Azevedo drafting the Stream Gauge Working Group report, and that just went out to WIPIC today or yesterday, and Stephen Bagley was a co-chair on that. So just thanks for that work there. And then just thanks again for Michael for the drought outlook report for the summer that you guys have in front of you today. So a lot of work coming out from the water division in terms of kind of drought and flooding and stream gauging. So a lot moving forward. And then Paul will be at WIPIC on the 11th presenting this report. And so I encourage everyone to tune in to kind of the result of that working group.
Cool. Thanks for the update. Certainly a lot happening right now. And Director Castor, did you want to say good morning as well?
Sure. Good morning. I think Anna just did a great job covering the DNRC update. I'm kind of slowly coming back from some maternity leave, so I'm really here to listen and get up to speed. So thank you and good morning.
Morning and congratulations. It's exciting and welcome back. So I think across those, you can see that it really does take everyone working together to try to understand what's happening, how it's impacting different sectors, different geographies. We've got a conversation around drought and flooding and emergency response in the same opening remarks here. And so it's really remarkable to think about how diverse the needs of our state are and the role that each of us plays in thinking about both existing conditions and how to plan for the future. So we do want to move into a few updates now on just what do those existing conditions look like. And we'll start with a drought monitoring demonstration and an update on current conditions from Troy Blanford over at the Montana State Library. So Troy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And good morning to the committee and everyone else who joined us today. Ironically, I'm bringing you the drought presentation today while shut out of my office due to flooding. So the state library got hit pretty hard by the Sunday storm. It started out with hail and it plugged up our drain. We've got a pretty flat roof and it's in the center there, and it filled up with hail, and then the hail backed up the water, and then the weight of the water pulled the drain down, and water just poured in. We had inch of standing water across most of the second floor and the bottom floor. So we're all shut out of the office. All the computers are down. They've been moved to another building and are getting hooked up now. But anyways, that's why I'm not there in person. I didn't have anywhere to prep this morning. I didn't have an office to go to. So we'll proceed here remotely, and that's it's going to work out pretty good since I'm going to be doing a live demo. It's a little bit easier with Zoom. So let me share my screen here. Let me know when you see that. It should be my PowerPoint presentation with the intro slide.
Yes.
All right.
All right, looks good, Troy.
All right, thanks. And so a presentation is a little bit different today than what you typically receive from me. I'm going to be doing a drought demo for you. So walk through like how we do our weekly assessment and just give you a flavor for that. And it's going to be my perspective of how I do that as an author, but we do have all the other authors on here as well. And I welcome them to chime in at the end and share anything you do a little bit different or just point out how you see it. But first, let's get into the drought map. So the next drought map comes out tomorrow. So this is from last week. We've continued to make improvements across the southern part of the state, the southeast part of the state, northeast part of the state, northwest part of the state, around much of the state. Of course, all the flooding going on or that happened down in south central, back to normal there. Just a reminder that the U.S. Drought Monitor doesn't track the wet side, so we're not seeing just how wet some of those counties are. Our drought status by county map that the library puts out will track that wet side. We haven't released our July map yet, but I expect some of those counties down there to be sitting on the more moist side. The problem area continues to be kind of the Golden Triangle up there. I will say that within the last few weeks, there's been some timely rains there. Still though, any longer range than that, pretty dry up there. This is a look at improvements that have been made. So these are the 4-week change, so the last month. So most of what happened in June. You see the 3-category change down there in Southwest Montana, Big Red County. That went from D2 to now no drought, D nada. And then across much of the southern part of the state, east part of the state, category or two improvement. And actually most of the state category improvement. I think that's the story this year for drought. It's been timely, very timely precipitation. Compare that to last year in 2017, so especially 2017, where it was just terrible timing. Rain just shut off there in May and June. Different this year with some pretty good precip in May and June for most of the state. The exception there being the Golden Triangle up there. You do see the 1-class degradation there for the month of June for that area. Went from D3 back to D4. Just looking at the drought severity and coverage index. So this number here on the right side is it's 155. I can't see it right now because it's blocked, but sitting somewhere around there, around 150. So still pretty high drought index there. If you compare that to the past 20 years that the U.S. Drought Monitor has been going, probably still in the top 8, maybe 10 there, but still significantly better from last year for this time of year. Last year looks like it was hovering around 375 or so, and we're down about 150.
Hey Troy, what are the units?
Yeah, this is a simple calculation of the percent area in each category. So it's like 1 times the percent in D1, 1 times the area in D2, D3. So there's no real units there. It just serves as a way of comparing all the years across the record.
Thanks.
So I mentioned the drought monitor, or the new map's going to come out tomorrow. I did want to present this. This is the draft. Aaron Peters is our author this month. And you can see that we're still mostly making some changes again, precip early this week, Sunday, and on through the week, there's been some precip. So we're going to be making some more changes there, getting up back some additional D0 here in Petroleum County and also south of Butte, moving now into D nada. There is one area there that we're at least initially proposing at D3. You can see the red there at the 180-day SPI sitting there east of Great Falls. Expand that D3 down. And Aaron might have an update after about where it actually stands with our proposal. Now I want to get into more about like what we do on a weekly basis, and just we've presented this before, but just a quick reminder here. So we coordinate weekly with the U.S. Drought Monitor, and we've got 5 leads here in Montana that kind of get everything started, do some draft suggestions, send it out to this listserv of about 50 people for additional suggestions. Those authors are listed there at DNRC, Michael Downey, myself at the State Library, and then to the Climate Office, Zach Hoylman and Kelsey Jinso, and with the National Weather Service, Aaron Peters. And again, Aaron's our author this week. Just a quick overview of how this works. So on Monday, that Montana lead draft suggestions. They look through all the metrics and make some suggestions, mock it up on a map, email that out to that drought listserv. So that goes out Monday, and then Tuesday we receive comments from folks on the listserv, make any adjustments from there. By Tuesday afternoon, early Wednesday, the recommendation is then sent to the national author at the U.S. Drought Monitor, and then the map is published first thing Thursday morning. So this is just a general guidance that we follow as the drought leads. And I write here general guidance because this is kind of how I see it. This is what I do typically each week. I think all the other leads would kind of agree with this, but there's little things that each of us does a little bit different, and that's a really good thing. And I think that's what's makes this really work, and is having these 5 different authors that we've got slightly different perspectives in how we look at this, and having that rotate through each week brings a lot of value to this process. We're seeing things that other folks don't. So again, this monitoring is weekly. So it's just as a general guidance, you've got a starting point at the beginning of the week. So at least initially, you're starting to think about what has happened this past week. Next, what are the major drought metrics in play? And so you got to think about the seasonality. Is it spring, summer, fall? What kinds of things are going on? Just as an example for right now, being early summer here, it's really the shorter timescales that are really important for precip, for getting crops going, keeping things green. But then there's also a longer timescale component there that if we're getting average conditions in the spring, but that's on top of some pretty terrible conditions before that, are we really getting anywhere? And then as the third one there, generally looking for a 1 or 2 class improvement or degradation. So is it 1 or 2 classes wetter or drier? And from there, we make the improvement. So if it's just sitting there at normal, or it's just kind of hovering right around where the US Drought Monitor currently has it, we're not going to make any change. And then the last one there, just the general guidance of the US Drought Monitor, that we only make 1 category change per week. That's the maximum, is 1 change. And then you've got to keep that gradient. So D1 needs to be adjacent to D0 and D2 needs to be adjacent to D1. So that's the general guidance. And then this was just an example of kind of following that. Last time I was the drought author, and that was, a week or 2 ago here. So I started with the 1 week precipitation observations. That kind of gave me a sense of what areas should I be looking at. We wouldn't really make changes or suggestions based solely on the precip that happened that previous week, but it's alerting us to places to take a closer look within our other metrics. I then reviewed the temperature percentiles. It's been a cool year. This year's been pretty cool on through, even through now. So really no concerns there with temperature. So that let us know that, really the most important factor here is going to be precip. That standardized precipitation index is what we leaned on most heavily, as opposed to the SPEI, which takes into ET evapotranspiration. We then compared the US drought monitor with the 30, 60, and 90-day SPI, and then I looked at that in comparison to the 1-year SPI, and then my suggestion ended up being the 60-day kind of moderated to 1 year. So we're really looking at a lot of different time scales and a lot of different metrics. And then lastly there, I just compare it. I look at soil moisture, I look at stream flow, I look at snow, I look at the drought impact reports, and is anything indicating otherwise to what we've suggested so far. So that's kind of a general overview of how this works. And then now I wanted to actually get into kind of walking through maybe the assessment for this week. So I'm going to switch to my browser now. Let me know if I need to reshare, if that you're now looking at a browser. You should be looking at the drought indicators dashboard.
Oh, we have your last slide there.
All right, let me reshare. Thanks. All right. How about now?
There you go. Keep out.
There we go. So I mentioned that one of the first things I do is I just think, okay, we're at a good starting point. What happened this past week? So this is precipitation from the National Weather Service. So these are observations. On the right here, I've set up to look at the last week. So we're looking at 6/28 to 7/5. And I just kind of pan around and look and think about this. So, I've seen an inch here in Petroleum County. It's worth noting, and 1.8 over here, Miles City area. Billings, there's the Helena hit with that 1 inch. 1 inch up there in Glacier County. So just kind of look at that and think, okay, like we've got some pretty good precip values again here in the southeast part of the state. We already know that's sitting at D nada, so there's no changes to be made there. But it does, there's also this band through here of an inch, 0.73 up kind of further towards the center of the state. So think about that area that's currently in D0. And that's about the extent of that, just getting a sense for what happened this past week. And the key thing with this little dashboard is that all the observations are in here. It just scales them. So if I'm out, I only see, it's filtering these. I don't see as many. So I can change these to look at change the data density and dig in a little bit more to see. So once you get south of Helena, the numbers start to drop a bit. It was really just inch focused right on Helena and the state library. Move into the drought dashboard. When it first comes up, it's just blank, and you've got these variables on the left side. You choose your variable. So just thinking about what we just looked at, okay, we kind of highlighted some precip happened on the southeast part of the state, Helena area, and then also the north central. So I'll take a look at the precipitation percentiles. And I've got different time scales here that I look at, 15-day, 30-day, 60-day. So you can see just in the last couple of weeks, there's that precip showing up on the southeast part of the state. So I'll just look through each of these 15-day, 30-day, 60-day, make sure that's lining up with what kind of those observations we just saw. And again, it's, you know, around kind of the outside of the state here.
Thank you.
I'll make note of kind of in the central part of the state, at that 60-day, 30-day time step, still pretty dry there. So indicating probably no change there unless it's actually leaning more towards an actual degradation. I mentioned temperature and how we're typically thinking about temperature a lot in the summer. It's been a bit different this year. But just as I go through an analysis for this week, I might step through these, you know, all the way out to a full year out. Temperature is not really a concern here at all. We're right around normal there at the 1 year time step now. So that's kind of factors into the decision on what metrics should we really be looking at. And that comes down to a standardized precipitation index, which is just looking at precip versus a standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index that takes into that temperature component. So from there, knowing that temperature is not as big of a factor this year, we'll probably lean a little bit more heavily on SPI, standardized precipitation. And then we'll think about seasonality. So we're in the summer here. We know that short range precip is going to be really important for crops and for terrestrial needs. So we'll start in here, the 60-day, 90-day range, and just get a peek. It looks like that's still matching up pretty well with the observations we just saw kind of around the outside of the state here. If we jump into more at the 90 days now, still kind of the same pattern, and on out to a year, generally the same pattern now. Now, earlier in the year, before this more recent precip, we were still seeing some more average values along the outside here. So we've seen movement now even in the 1 year full time step. And again, now that central part of the state here is popping. East of Great Falls here, this would be a kind of an expansion here. So if I turn on the US Drought Monitor overlap, you see it's matching pretty well. All the blue now is showing normal. The yellow is overlapping with the yellow pretty good. Up here with the reds, we've got this extension here in the Fergus County. And I know that Aaron noticed that and was going to do some expansion here at B3. So from there, I'll just kind of flip back and forth and try to get, you know, where are things really lining? Are we lining up at the kind of short range and the longer range as well? Thinking about 90-day and those improvements, we might make some improvements here from petroleum, our field. But I'll cross-check that, you know, against 1 year SPI. Does that kind of line up? It does. You know, we're now average there. That was a little bit behind. It was more in the yellow or brown in past weeks, but we've now gotten back up to average-ish. So that would be an area that would make sense to propose an improvement there to D0 from D1. South of Helena there, Butte area, kind of the same thing. We're seeing kind of a splotchy yellows there, some browns there. And then if you look shorter range though, you see it's actually blue and back up above normal there. So we'd think about an improvement there as well. The Helena area, you probably try to keep it south of Helena, and that's kind of where these gradients come in. You're trying to make sure it maintains this, you know, you're going from D nada to D0 to D1 and just keeping a gradient there. And just looking at the precip, that gradient seems to be from kind of south that dries out a bit north. So we probably keep improvements south of Helena here. So that's the general process. So from there, I draw in these areas. I'd say let's do an improvement here and maybe south of Butte area and maybe up in here. But then I'll cross-check that with all sorts of other information, the big one being soil moisture. So we'll look at soil moisture now, and we can look at different depths. So I'm looking at 4-inch here for the colors of these dots here. And you can see it's matching up reasonably well with the US Drought Monitor. Some blues down here. But one thing we noticed, if we go to like, say, 20 inches, we start to get more dry soils here, even in the southeastern part of the state. That's where that keeping an eye on those longer timescales comes into play. That's why we keep an eye on those. So we're looking pretty good at the 4-inch here. We're seeing quite a few blue stations here, soil stations. Once you get those bigger depths, 8 inches, 20 inches, you're still seeing some dryness there. So even in that part of the state. Normally, we'd also look at snow. Obviously, it's not a big deal right now. There is still some snow out there, though. Some of the higher peaks have snow, some snow through here and down in the southern basins as well. So still some snow coming off. And then we'll also look at NDVI. So this is greenness, wetness, and the trend there. You see nothing really particular standing out there. You do see it at the 15-day NDVI is a little bit below normal, more at that 30-60 day, pretty typical for the state. With that, that's all I wanted to really go through. I did want to ask all the other authors if you had more input there to chime in.
No, I was just going to mention that on the soil moisture data now, you can click on those points and get a time series of soil moisture at one of those points, and then compare it to the previous years for that same time period. So it's kind of a nice visualization to try to understand how certain precipitation events have impacted soil moisture dynamics and how they compare to recent years.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I meant to mention that. So here's the plot that he's talking about. This purple here is 2022. So you can see some bumps here, and even July here, the bump up. Versus in the background there, you see the past years. We could look at those at some of these other stations too, like maybe this area up here in the A4. You see no real improvement there at that 8-inch, pretty flat there. Versus past years, you see a few bumps here every once in a while.
Yeah, I guess, Troy, I just say that there are a ton of drought products out there. And so especially when things get pretty unclear, I think we'll kind of expand our look into some other products. Certainly in terms of dashboards that are out there, I think the climate office, there are other sites like the Climate Engine. There's this site trying to make those a little bit different. The Climate Engine can be a little bit clunkier, but what it does do is it allows you to look over longer time scales or drill down to different periods of time. There's other, NOAA has other vegetative health indices. So there's a lot of stuff out there. I think that the drought dashboard, we've done a really good job of creating a tool that can really that enables you to make an assessment really quickly. That said, this is a really complex, nuanced analysis that we have to go through, and so there are other products out there that we use.
Yeah, we've said this before, but I mean, huge thanks to the climate office. And I don't, 4 years ago or so before this dashboard came out, when we do our monitoring, we'd have maybe 8 to 10 different browsers open looking at products from all over the place. And this has just really helped get them all in one place and focus in on those metrics that are most important for Montana.
And I think, go ahead.
I was just going to ask Aaron if anything particular this week that he wanted to mention that maybe I missed.
Sorry, guys, I unmuted myself a minute ago to say something, and then the baby started crying. So anyway, no, I didn't have anything specific to add. I will say that it was really timely and nice that new update on the soil moisture came out that Zach mentioned, because the area that I'm proposing to degrade there in Choteau and Fergus County, has some recent precipitation. It was just nice to show that soil moisture profile hasn't really seen any response to to that precipitation compared to other years. So, you know, like Michael said, we use a lot of different things depending on the situation, and it can get very messy. And this is just one added tool that proved quite useful this week for that. So I haven't heard back from the author, the national author that is, on whether or not that recommendation was taken, but that it was useful anyway.
And I think one of the also part of the beauty of this dashboard is the fact that you can look at data. What is it, Zach? Now is it 12 states that we cover, and it kind of gives you a sense of where we lie in the spectrum of conditions. And so it's a really powerful tool for looking at, you know, clearly what's going on, you know, across the northern high plains and Northwest. That is, and as Troy mentioned, to be able to do that from one site versus going back and forth to all of these different sites really speeds up the process.
Yeah, really cool. Well, thanks so much, Troy, and appreciate the additions from Zach and Aaron online and Michael Downey here with DNRC in the room. Great to see kind of the art, the science, the data that goes into all of this, and the analysis, the recommendations, the process. And to Michael's point, how we are continuing to look at ways to improve and add different data sources and data layers to help us continue to gain the insight that we need to really think about what's happening out there on the landscape and to inform our planning and response plans. I want to turn next to Aaron Fiaschetti with the USGS, who's going to give us a streamflow conditions update here across the state. So, Aaron?
Good morning, and just to note that Kathy, Chase, and I will be co-presenting. I'll be presenting about streamflow conditions, and Kathy will be covering the flooding in South Central Montana.
Great, thank you.
And let me see here. Okay. So can you see my screen?
It's good.
Okay. All right. All right, well, here we are. Let me get my laser pointer going. All right, so here's a picture of our gauge house down here on Rock Creek near Red Lodge, about to tip in the water. So this will be a bit of a mix of really wet and some pretty dry conditions through the state. So I'll get into it here. So just kind of a point of where we are in the hydrograph for the water year. Here's Blackfoot near Bonners. So just a reference for west of the divide, your water supply is coming from the mountains. Kind of had a late and prolonged runoff here. And just a brief explanation here, these duration hydrographs are logarithmic on the y-axis, and then we have these percentiles here. The green is what the USGS classifies normal is, 25 to 75th percentile. Your median would be kind of the central tendency there. So that's a pretty wide range. The tans and the dark browns are below normal, the 10 to 24th. And that brown is the much below normal. So below the 10th percentile, very low flows. And then on the upper end, you have two shades of blue indicating above or much above normal, the 75th or greater than the 90th percentile. So we just kind of see chugging along from the beginning of the water year. We got kind of normal conditions here on the Blackfoot. Things kind of dip down pretty low into April. Beginning in middle of May, we start to get some pretty decent flows. Things bounce around a little bit. Runoffs prolonged because of our cool spring, and now we're receding into the falling limb of that hydrograph. Generally good water supply conditions in most locations here west of the divide right now. Looking at east of the divide, Missouri River near Toston, pretty low conditions coming in here April, May till the beginning of June. We get a pike or a pretty good spike there, coinciding with the rain event that occurred in the park that drove the flooding in South Central Montana. And now we're kind of quickly receding into the falling limb. Normal conditions, Missouri River at Toston right now. So kind of falling probably pretty close to the median right about now. Late runoff, so just to note there. And then just kind of look at a prairie site here, Poplar River at IB in the northeast corner of the state. Below median runoff and stream flow conditions this year, not a lot of snowpack on the prairie and not a lot of rain to kind of sustain that flow. So as we see right now, this black line, we're starting to dip off into those below normal conditions here in the northeast corner. So just to look at the snapshot of this is from the National Water Information Dashboard, how current real-time stream flow conditions match with the drought monitor. It's kind of a sea of green, normal conditions, and blue here, which is good. If you surf around and look a lot of these sites, a lot of the normal green conditions are near the median or above the median. So that's a pretty good indicator that flows are good. And we're at a good point in water supply. So it's not like flows would normally be really low. So generally things look pretty good agreement between drought classification and stream flow gauges. One note up here where it is D3 and D4 and you see a green dot, chances are that water supply is coming from the mountains or it's coming from an area of lesser drought. So it's just water passing through the area and generally not so much indicative of drought conditions in that spot. There are some low flows out here on the Milk River. Part of that would be water operations from the project. To note too, there's been a couple dry years for that project, and that project is probably still feeling the effects of having that canal shut down a few years ago. So moving on, so we do have some low flows here still, even though it's kind of a sea of green. Looking here in the Helena area, this is Little Prickly Pear Creek near Wolf Creek. And it just, you come in here from the fall into the winter, flows are pretty normal. And then it's kind of like runoff really never happened here on Little Prickly Pear, that things just kind of continued to recede into May and June when there should have been pretty good water supply. And if you look up at the Southern Rocky Mountain front on the Dearborn, it's kind of similar conditions that runoff didn't really materialize in a way that it normally would. And then if we go up here southeast of Havre, Peoples Creek near Hayes, that's water coming out of the Bears Paw Mountains. A similar thing when the water should have been there, there just wasn't a lot of snow or precipitation to generate that water. So pretty dry conditions up there on that creek, even though right now it shows it's green and normal. Sometimes you got to take a little deeper look at these sites to see what's going on. So just I'll run through a few cumulative hydrographs here, and I just wanted to explain these graphics again just to everyone. So what I'm trying to convey here is a timing of flow and then a quantity of flow. And what we're looking at is April 1 to July 31st cumulative runoff period. And that's the same as what NRCS issues their stream flow forecast for. So what these three bar graphs are showing a timing of when 25%, 50%, or 75% of that period runoff volume could have occurred. It's not an end all be all of when the earliest it could ever came out or the latest it could be. It's just a couple select years where I looked at a cool wet year, think 2007, or a warm dry year, think 2021. So just to give an idea of when that volume of water might have passed the gauge and where we would be in that cumulative hydrograph. So here would show 25% of the water could have come out April 25th or 24th, or it could have come out as late as May 7th, and so on, with 75% of the water could have came out June 5th or June 15th. So that's a percentage of runoff here on the bar chart, and what's important is the x-axis. And then I'm trying to convey a quantity. So here's the period of record average, the black dashed line, and here's what occurred in 2022, the blue line. So we'll just move on. Blackfoot River near Bonner. Here's that blue line. We're below the period of record. We're about 87% of the water We're 80% of the average for this day for the cumulative volume. So we're past when 75% of the water should have come out. Most of the volume should have moved through the system by now. So generally flows are below normal at that cumulative volume. And here's part of the reason why. This is a graphic from the NRCS. There's similar percentiles to what the USGS has, but what's important here is this green line, that's the median SWE, and this little green X, which would be that peak SWE. And then the other important line is this black line, that's 2022. So we never really reached that median SWE or that median snowpack in the area. And that's probably part of the reason why we're seeing that below normal cumulative volume in the Blackfoot. And you show this too, is that late runoff or that late melting of the snowpack here in the Blackfoot. Moving over to the fissure near Libby, well, things look pretty good here. We see that kind of lagged behind that cumulative volume coming up into the later part of June, but now we're at exactly at average. We're 100% of the average, so things look pretty good. And the agreement here is that the black line is near the median, near that green line. So snowpack looked pretty good up in the fissure. So things look pretty good up there. Poplar River at IB, we're 30% of the period of record average here. So pretty low cumulative volumes there of runoff coming through the Poplar River and into the Montana.
See you later. Hey, Daryl, is Robin, is it ROBY? I am.
Moving over to the Yellowstone at Corwin Springs, of course, location where we had that large flood event. Things were lagging pretty low behind as we come into May and June. And then here we have this very large event, and we're 107% of the average now. So you can have a really low snowpack here. Here's that 2022 snowpack for the Yellowstone, upper Yellowstone snowtail sites, and then have one huge flood event. And cumulatively, it kind of shakes out to be above average. So I guess that's one way to bust a drought. Moving over to the Missouri at Toston, the cumulative volume, 77% of the average. Last time I presented, I noted that they needed 600,000 acre feet to fill Canyon Ferry. And they were actually the Bureau of Rec was able to fill Canyon Ferry to 90%, 98%. So a lot of that water went into storage and was able to bring that up to near full with limited water in the system. So quite a bit lower over on the Missouri at Toston, where they didn't have that precipitation, that rain to fill it up. And here's that below the median SWE at the site. So part of the contributing factor to lower flows. And one more here where things look a little bit better is the Ruby above the reservoir, 94% of the period of record average for cumulative volume. Ruby Reservoir was filled, and just note over at Clark Canyon, that's only 50% full right now. So they weren't able to put fill that reservoir up. So here's one more of the SWE in the Ruby, lagged behind quite a bit. And with the SWE, that late April snow and some precipitation, that cumulatively over at the site, they were able to come pretty close to the average. So just general takeaways, flows are normal with the quotes. So they're probably generally pretty close to the median throughout the state or above. Runoff is winding down. We're in a period of generally good water supply. So there's water to go around right now for the moment. Runoffs for most of the sites that we took a look at are below average, with a few being near it. And then we have still seeing persistent low flows at a lot of sites. So the sites are still kind of reeling from the drought in lieu of recent moisture. And it's only a snapshot, so I'll turn it over to Kathy right now and let her present about the flooding. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I heard a perfect description of stream flows across Montana. Somebody called conditions inconsistent. And that's what makes life really interesting working and living here in Montana, I think, because just the week before the floods hit, we were debating drought conditions in these areas and the areas just to the east here. So pretty interesting. I thought I'd just provide a little bit of information about the flooding we saw on the Yellowstone River and in the Yellowstone River Basin. So these are hydrographs. So we see the date on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis is the stream flow in cubic feet per second. And just note that these are provisional data that our staff are still working really hard to confirm the stream flows out there. They're doing a lot of work out in the field and later in the office to confirm. So right now it's provisional, these values could change. So if Aaron could click the first, the Corwin Springs hydrograph is that red line, and you can see it peaking up pretty close to 50,000 cubic feet per second on Monday, June 13th. So surprising for many of us, I think. I don't know if anybody was expecting this much flow, and that's an interesting discussion perhaps for another time. But we can see then how those peaks progress downstream. So Aaron, if you could click on the next peak, is that green line, and that's again, these are provisional data at Livingston. So, we saw the peak at Corwin Springs about midday afternoon on June the 13th, and then the peak hit Livingston that night. And then finally, the next stream gauge on the Yellowstone at Billings, where the peak took a couple days to travel down. And by the time it got to Billings, it was still a very large peak, but it wasn't as large compared to the period of record as these upper flows were. So next slide. And this is just a summary of the flows along the Yellowstone, those hydrographs we just looked at. And there towards the left side, Aaron, if you could click shows the event peaks. So again, at Yellowstone River at Corwin Springs, we almost had 50,000 CFS, pretty close to 50,000 CFS. And then we can compare that to the previous peak of record, and we can see that those are much larger, especially for those upper two sites, much larger than any peak we've observed. And we have, if you look a couple columns over, that's the number of peaks that we have. So we have nice long periods of records here, and still we were way above anything we saw. And then Aaron, if you could click twice, you can also compare that to the 0.2%, which is like the 1 in 500 year event. And we can see that it's much larger than what we've computed as this 0.2% or 1 in 500 flow for those upper two sites. And then one more click here. And for the site at Billings, it's somewhere between the 1% and the 0.2%. So pretty rare event for these sites. Next slide. These are other tributaries in the Yellowstone River Basin where we saw very high flows. So Aaron, if you could give it one click, we can see that the event peaks during this past event. Most of these happened on that Monday. Especially the Stillwater River near Absaroka. These are all provisional. That one has the additional sort of disclaimer of being, it's right now just estimated. So that number probably will change. We know it's a high flow though. So if you could click the next one, we can see, again, we are above the peaks of record for those sites. And then a couple more clicks, we can see that we're higher than the 0.2% again for these sites as well. And then one more slide showing flows on the Clark's Fork. If you could click that, showing those are the peaks for the event. And then you can compare those to the previous peaks. The Clark's Fork was much higher than any peaks on record. And then a couple more clicks, you can see it's much higher than that 0.2% as well. So one more slide, just summarizing. Again, these are all provisional data. Our office were out there, our staff were out there during the flood, taking measurements, making repairs. You saw the gauge at Rock Creek. Unfortunately, that equipment had to be pulled, or some of it might be floating in the river. I don't know, but they're out there actively repairing, surveying to try to make sure that the data that we're serving are as up to date as possible. And then right now, our data section are out there, again, continue to make repairs. And they're also out there doing indirect flow measurements. So we can't be everywhere during the peak. We can't necessarily measure that peak discharge. So we go after the fact and we look for clues as to how high the flows were, and we can back calculate what that stream flow was. And we call that an indirect flow measurement. So that's going on right now. We'll probably have about 20 sites that we're computing indirect flows for, both at active stream gauges and discontinued ones at all. And so we also have what's called a mission assignment with FEMA to flag or try to delineate the inundation at 3 communities, at Livingston, Red Lodge, and Fromberg. So we've had people out doing that, and those will be published and available. And then thanks to our close relationship with DNRC, we're also doing a lot of indirect flow measurements at discontinued sites. So we've been working with Steve Story and his crew on those as well. And that's it for floods, unless anybody has questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaron and Kathy. Really appreciate the information and updates.
Do we want to, I mean, everybody has my report. My report is my report. You know, it covers a lot of what has been covered. I'm just wondering if for the sake of time, we just skip that, or I can run through it quickly. It's either way.
I think, why don't we take just a couple of minutes to go over it, because the conversations we've had so far are kind of looking at current conditions based on data, and I think it was worth the extra time, especially given the recent drought events and all of that, to hear from that. So let's take a couple minutes, do the drought outlook for Michael Downey and DNRC. We'll still take maybe a 5-minute question discussion session after that for anyone that would like to respond or have questions to anything that's been presented this morning. Take a short break and come back. We can still make some adjustments to our schedule for the drought task force to make sure that we end on time. Anna?
Can I ask a question to Kathy and Aaron?
Yeah.
On their presentation. Kathy, you kind of mid-sentence said we could talk about maybe anticipating these flows regarding flooding. And then when I look at our statutory requirements as a committee, it talks about how do we consider options for reducing vulnerability to flooding and drought and improve our forecasting? Can you shed some light on your quick comment there, and what can we be doing or thinking about as a state to, from an information perspective, to better prepare for flooding events or anticipate, if you would?
That's a really good question. And I think that's in close cooperation with the National Weather Service, because they work to provide peak flow, flood forecasts at certain sites. And again, the USGS provides data which are important for those flood forecasts. For instance, during the past event, our office was working very closely with Aaron and other meteorologists on, what are you seeing at your gauges, and how is it consistent with the forecasts or not? And so we work pretty closely together, and certainly are hoping to improve, how we work to understand when floods might be happening.
Are there specific recommendations you might have in terms of data needs? Or coordination is wonderful, but is there a specific recommendation that you might have for us or the state in terms of what information we might need to better anticipate? I'm thinking about areas of improvement, particularly since we're kind of writing a drought plan and want to think about areas that we might want to focus on.
So I'll just say data, keep supporting, and USGS does everything we can also to support the collection of data. And Aaron, I see is on, so you probably have additional because we had data on what was happening at Corin Springs, we had some information about what was about to hit Livingston, for instance. But I'll let Aaron also talk to this because
I'll just chime in really quickly. I think what Kathy just mentioned is data and every year, or not every year, but oftentimes we're talking about cutting stream gauges, right? Whether it's state gauges or USGS gauges losing funding. And every time we do that, particularly if it's a gauge that has a long history of record, we're losing enormous amounts of information that the Weather Service can use to produce the forecasts that we really try to do the best we can on those main stem rivers. And so anytime those are cut, it's a huge loss. And so if we can add more gauges, of course, that's amazing. More information about snowpack. The NRCS does a really amazing job with the network that they have, but they can only have so many snowtail stations per basin, and so there's so many unknowns with that. The other thing that helps, that in the future will help with, because of this last event, is because we broke so many records. The large scale hydrologic models that produce the forecasts and that we use to produce the forecast for these rivers do not handle records well, because they don't have previous information to go on. So all of our calibration is based on previous events, and when we break records by tens of feet, all bets are off. But the positive is that we now have this event to look back on, and so in the future, if we have another situation that comes like this, we can use that information to improve our forecast into the future. So I won't go on anymore, but that's kind of what I had to add.
Thank you for the question, Anna and Kathy and Aaron, for those responses. And it makes me think, it's a great question, thinking about what does the data tell us, and then how do we respond to new peak flows like this? And is there a question out there about, are the historical records adequate for predicting future conditions? And if not, are there ways to think differently about our data needs or what we might predict under the changing climatic conditions? So really good conversation and question.
Could I make a quick comment? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Chuck.
An instructive analysis, simple and easy analysis to do, is to plot peak April SWE versus the annual peak flows. And what one finds is that not the huge floods, but certainly many of the peak flows occur in years of the smallest snowpack. And the reason for that is a snowpack does not release significant snowmelt until it goes isothermal. Otherwise, the snow just falls on the snowpack and refreezes. But once it's near that melting point, it really cooks. So it's very vulnerable to rain on snow. And with the new period of climate we're entering, if we expect reduced snowpacks, which we're seeing, this may be a trend for the future, which compared with historic records kind of means we're into, I guess, a new hydrologic regime for peak flows. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. Appreciate you jumping in with that. Good. Don't want to cut off the conversation, but I know we did want to hear quickly on the drought outlook for the summer from Michael Downey. And there is a report available. It's posted online, but do you want to just share a couple of quick highlights, and then we'll see if there's any.
Yeah, and Sarah, have you got that? And I was kind of struck with that photo as I was coming back from a meeting in the Muscle Shell, and given an area that obviously burned really seriously last year, and to see that greening up, I thought was, oh great, thank you, was pretty striking. And certainly I think sums up just what we've seen this year in terms of the green up has been so driven. Certainly in part by our precip and accumulated precip, but a big part of the story this year has just been timing, which has really been ideal in that cool April and May and June that we had this year. So that was the middle of June, whereas of course middle of June last year we were burning up. This is where we were December 7th of 2021, which represented the latest in terms of the apex of our drought. And typically in September, October, November, we're accumulating moisture, and actually drought conditions are alleviating. And so you can see December 7th of last year, 100% of the state was in D1 to D4 drought. That's the largest. The D4 at 33% is the largest level of D4. In fact, that we've ever seen in the 22 years of the U.S. Drought Monitor. So really unusual year, and I think in ways a setup for this year in terms of what we could expect. I was pretty down in the mouth earlier this spring in terms of the forecast, the predictions and forecasts and where we were headed, and to see things kind of come around the way they have is to think that this is where we are here today on June 28th is not what I anticipated, and the map will actually, apart from that extension of the D3 heading in down towards Lewistown, will have improved some more. So really great news in terms of what we're looking at for the rest of the summer, when it's likely to get dry and hot, but it gets dry and hot every year in Montana in July and in August. And Troy showed us one of these before, the change maps. You can see that where we are. This is an 8-week, and certainly in 8 weeks since early June, where we actually were reintroducing, or April, early May, where we were introducing D4 into north central Montana. Things have come a long way. I think that part of our story, though, this year is where we were April 15th, which is typically is when we're getting peak sweet, and on April 15th, things were looking very different, and we had those the Musselshell and the Shields and the Smith that were much below normal. The Northwest that was looking pretty good, but I think that this goes to even what Chuck was talking about, and that in some of those late storms that as we saw things improve through April and May, and that really that colder weather that kind of extended our snowpack, that did make us more susceptible to that rain on snow event that we saw in the Yellowstone Basin, which, as was also pointed out, which was below peak sweet. Then we had that large snow event followed by a large rain event, and that flooding that ensued. This was here later in May, and you can see that improvement with that late snowfall, which of course is kind of atypical for what we normally get when we've typically peaked in mid-April and then are continuing to drop. This is the vegetative health index, and I'm looking at this. This is this year. We'll look at what next year was like. Now, in terms of that graph, that's not percentiles. In terms of the colors that you see there, that is a proxy for vegetative health, with anything that's in the green to blue indicating better production, and that's both for range and for crops. Anything trending into yellow and red will be below normal production. And so you can still see where that north central Montana and extending over into Lewistown is looking like they're going to have much below normal vegetative production. This is where we were last year on the same date, on July 1st. So things have improved radically. Pretty much we're looking at the entire state was below normal vegetative health to much below normal in terms of production. So what a difference a year makes. this is where we are in terms of precipitation difference from average. And you can see again, that graph goes from 3 inches above normal to 3 inches below normal, and that north central Montana really sticking out in terms of where they are for precipitation. I think that even in Helena, as we look at our green up, and apart from this latest event, we had half of our normal precip in June, and so we were about 1.1 versus 2.1, and so. I mean, everybody's talking about, God, it's been so rainy in June. It's like, well, it's more that our memories are short. And June is really supposed to be a lot rainier than in fact it was. It's our wettest month. And so I still think that we're going to see things probably are going to worsen across that north central portion of the state through July, unless July is really unusual, which let's hope that it is. The forecast is for this storm system to be moving out, and it's more likely than not we're going to get hotter and drier. But at least for a majority of the rest of the state is in really good shape. There again, what a difference a year makes. This was where we were a year ago, with June was our driest on record, our second warmest on record, and obviously led to the dire conditions that we had this year. So we are much improved from what we were a year ago, which if you look at certainly the Southwest California, parts of Oregon are still very deep in drought. This is an updated wildfire potential, which was just for July. Montana just was moved from being above normal for wildfire potential to a normal, which is great news. So much of the state was red a month ago, and now we're going to have fires in July. Montana always has fires in July, but at the potential for that being normal versus above normal, which is where we've been for the last couple of years. And then in August, you can see that north central and really central Montana, and even extending down into Wyoming and the Dakotas in Oklahoma is really where the most significant fire potential remains. And so finally, for the drought outlook for the remainder of the season was just updated here just a month ago. Was not looking nearly that good, but there again, it's that north central Montana which stands out in terms of that drought persisting at least into September. Right, there you go. And then for this report is online and obviously goes through into a lot more detail than I just provided. That report is online. I put that out to our drought listserv, as well as others that are on our interested persons listserv. But you can find that both on the Drought Hub, Drought Montana MT, droughtinfo.org, as well as DNRC's website, or just shoot me an email and I'll be sure to get that out to you right away. Very good.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. And I know we're running a little bit behind schedule here, but we just heard a lot of really great, helpful, useful information. And there may be a couple of questions. So just want to open it up for a few minutes of questions and discussion. Start first with the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee members to see if there's anyone that has any questions, comments. Steve?
I have a question. I noticed in your report, Michael, that you didn't have at the time of writing it, whatever, you didn't have a overview of the state projects and kind of where they are in terms of water levels and whatnot. Do you have any more updates on that?
You know, that report comes out here in a couple of days, so I don't have an update for where we are in July. And there again, so the latest update that we have was from early June. I suspect that kind of given given the last couple of weeks, things have improved a bunch. And there again, in your projects here and the south in southwest Montana, in the east, in the northwest, things are in pretty good shape. Gibson did fill, and so for the green fields is in good shape. I think that the milk was so far behind, and Fresno was so far down that that's going to continue to present problems this year. They're certainly not out of the woods. It flows, and as Aaron pointed out, flows are below normal up there. But I think that certainly in terms of, there's been a lot of dugouts for stock water. Things have improved a bunch across the state, which is great news.
Good discussion. Other questions from, was that committee member? All right, anyone else have questions?
I just had a quick question on that topic. In terms of upstream from Clark Canyon, what is sort of the assumption? I mean, there seems to be some water up there, but just not seeing any sort of response in fill of Lima or Clark Canyon, any.
Yeah, and
I wouldn't even say hypotheses, any grousings that you might have.
Yeah, and I'm not the one to ask. That's more of a hydrologic question. But I think that part of what's driving conditions in southwest Montana is that you're really, I mean, as of this spring, we were into our third year of drought down there. So the level of kind of the level in terms of loss of soil moisture, I think a lot of where that moisture is going is into replenishing groundwater. I mean, I do think that things have improved in Clark Canyon. And as a result, we've seen things improve on the Beaverhead, which earlier this spring was at record low flows. But for the Red Rock, I don't feel like I have got a good enough hand on that pulse to really answer that.
Yeah, did you have?
I see Stephanie Misick is on the call.
Yeah, could we ask, please?
I just sent her a message. So.
Okay.
Stephanie, I'm not sure if you're listening to us here. We were just wondering if you might be listening in on the call and able to provide some additional insight into the question that Clayton asked. All right.
She's on something.
Yeah, and I know people are juggling a lot, so. Any other questions, comments? Well, very good. I really do appreciate all the information and updates. So thank you, Troy, and the additions from Zach and Aaron Peters. Did see Aaron put a message in the chat as we were having our conversation here that the recommendations that he put forward were accepted by the national author. And so we will be expecting the recommendations to move forward in that next update. And then Aaron and Kathy from USGS, thank you for the stream flow conditions and flood information and for the outlook that Michael Downey just provided. Really important conversation, lots of data, lots to think about, both in terms of making sense of where we are and then thinking ahead. So let's take a quick break. What time is it? It's 53 after. Let's take a 7-minute break so we can come back at the top of the hour, and then we'll jump into the drought task force conversation. I'm going to start with just some quick updates on where we are and then jump pretty quickly into the conversation around what are we doing around our response actions and recommendations, and then how do we think about the intersection between these two committees as we move forward. So let's take a quick break and we'll see everyone back at 11. So even though we've got a lot of the same topics up for conversation, a little bit different focus here for our last hour together. So this is really focused on the drought task force. So all the committee members can switch your hats if you haven't already done so, from DWSAC to the drought task force. And as we get grounded in this conversation, I want to start with a quick update from the planning team here at DNRC on just where are we? What does the Montana drought plan look like? Where are we making progress across the multiple plan components? And then from there, we were just having a conversation in the break that what we want to do is build a bridge between the conversation we just had and the planning process itself. And so actually going to suggest switching the order that's in your agenda and talk about what is the role of DWSAC in helping to support, advance, inform conversations around the drought planning process. And I know there've been a lot of conversations in between meetings, in part thanks to all the work Megan has been doing, reaching out to members, to staff and to others to look for gaps and recommendations, to really think about that administrative framework and response actions, gaps and needs. And so we'll return to that before we conclude and gather just some updates on where we are and any additional insights from committee members, any questions from those who are joining us online around actions and recommendations, and then look at the road ahead with some next steps here and still conclude around noon. So that's our quick overview. And from there, Sarah, I'm going to ask you to just jump in with a quick update.
Thank you. So folks online, you send me through this handout in the chat. So you should have a link to that. It's on the mtdroughtinfo.org website. And for the folks in the room, this is sort of a multi-page handout here. The first page is just updates on, since we last met, on the status of updating the drought plan. I'm not really going to go through it all. You have it available. I wanted to just point out, the different plan components on the left. Those will be, big kind of sections of the plan once it's complete. With the vulnerability assessment, our folks are currently being interviewed. We've had the first interview of stakeholders, regional stakeholders, about sort of their local experience with drought was June 23rd. And so far, we've got about 30 members of the regional stakeholder groups that have come forward and said they would like to be interviewed. So that's super exciting. That is progressing well and will continue throughout the summer. There will also be a survey that we'll hand out to you all that we'd love for you to complete and really pass it to your networks. We're just kind of trying to go for big response there with that online survey. And the vulnerability assessment will wrap up in the fall of this year. For the operational framework, all of the task force members should have gotten an email from Megan Burke, who's here today with us, who is tasked with kind of developing the response portion of the plan as well as the operational framework. And we do have your feedback and insights and new recommendations about management actions. So our next step will be to somehow digestively compile all of that and potentially do a working meeting in August where we can kind of really dive into that and begin to look at things in a much more detailed fashion across the spectrum of agencies. The last thing that I'll mention is just these adaptation strategies. We've had a professional writer traveling throughout Montana. He's back in July and going to complete the final 3 of these 6 adaptation strategies, adaptation vignettes. And these are just really kind of cool personal stories about folks who are working within their sector and within their community to adapt to drought, because obviously that's going on all the time. So featuring new innovative strategies with that project. And yeah, I guess I could either run through the rest of the handout or turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So that's a quick overview of the different drought plan components and status. And I think just because this is the first time a lot of people are looking at the handout, if you want to run through what else is here and how it's going to inform the conversation moving forward, that'd be great.
Great. So the next page 2 of the handout is simply just, I think a lot of this will be familiar with you all in the work that you do, but kind of a table that shows some of the main federal programs that are used for drought response and management. So you'll notice there's Department of Agriculture programs on the top row. There's the Water Smart Drought Response Program through Bureau of Reclamation. A lot of folks are familiar with those resources. There's some FEMA information, and then of course the Small Business Administration has loans related to drought. So we just wanted to kind of include that here as a bit of a quick reference for our discussion, just with the understanding that there are myriad federal resources available for drought response. And so you have that if you need to kind of reference that. That's not everything, but it's kind of some of the main programs. Page 3 will help possibly inform our conversation today, and then moving forward, when we can convene a working meeting and really focus on this. But what we did as DNRC staff was put together a couple examples of gaps that we have noticed in our learning about drought management in Montana. And so we'd love to hear from you today and moving forward what you've noticed based on your role at your agency or looking at what other agencies do. We'd love to hear that from you. And then the last 2 pages are the statute, the actual language from the DWSAC or the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee statute with the specific duties of DWSAC highlighted in yellow on page 4. And so that's just to tee up or just as a reference again for our discussion today. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, for running through that. And I know a lot of folks are just looking at this for the first time. And if you do have a few minutes here as we're going through our conversation to focus on some of those emerging examples on page 3, I think the hope is that we can start moving from the individual conversations that we're having with Megan at the agency level into more integrated conversations that respond to some of your earlier goals. When we started talking about statewide drought management plan and this new update in particular, how can it be more integrated, more proactive, really looking towards the future needs of the state, all the different agencies and roles that you play, as well as the citizens that we serve. And so that's a real chance for us to start thinking about both responses, which I think are probably what comes to mind first in a lot of people's minds when it comes to drought, as well as adaptation resources or approaches that we might take. So just to plant that seed, but before we go any further, I do want to have a conversation that's more in that administrative and roles category about, well, who has these different roles and how do you play them, and how do we think about the intersection between the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee and this task force, especially as we go through the planning process and then into plan adoption and implementation. And so to help us with that conversation, I'm going to turn it back over to Michael Downey. He's going to talk about the role of DWSAC, and in your handout, page 4 and 5 gives the current statutory information around the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee, as well as the stream gauge oversight work group. So, Michael?
Yeah. Why is that? Here we go. So I just want to give just a brief history of where this group started, and I think that helps inform the conversation about where we might go from here. And really, the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee was born out of really public. It was out of public dissatisfaction with the state response to drought after the droughts in 85, 86, in 1988. And so as a result, what they did is they formed a drought steering committee to develop some recommendations. At the same time, there was a state water planning process that was going on. Back then, they were kind of doing it section by section, and they were developing the drought section. And the drought steering committee came up with the recommendations that you can see there on the screen. And really, that's you can see that it follows pretty closely in terms of what this committee does today. And I think that obviously things have become organized a little bit differently, but those drought steering committee recommendations were wrapped up into House Bill 537, which was introduced in 1991, and that kind of wrapped up those committee recommendations and came out with the really the major pieces that we find in our legislation today. I think that what was interesting, though, if you look back at that original House Bill 537, and it says, it's each agency will assess drought. I mean, that's how this was first looked at, is that, well, we're going to have each agency is going to look at drought and make those individual assessments. And I think that pretty early on, found that was not a terribly efficient way to go. And so while each agency still has responsibilities for drought, in terms of doing that within the committee structure, didn't work very well. And so that evolved into what we have today. I want to, so now this group, it's an organizing body that providing both oversight and the collection of drought information that is then disseminated to the public and to agencies. I mean, it's a coordinating body for sharing information. I think over the years, if you look back at the record, this group, there's always been a bit of a I think, question when it comes to what is our role? What do we, as I often hear from people, it's like, but what do we do? What do they do? And as we get ready to look at the statute and the language in the statute, it is very clearly an advisory body. And I think that in some that I've talked to, and I've talked to people all the time about this, are very satisfied with the role that it serves in terms of disseminating information and providing a repository and a central place for information. Certainly in 2017, this group really upped its game so that we were better aligned with the U.S. Drought Monitor. And that's the work of the monitoring committee. That committee was deputized, if you will, to provide information to become that expert source of information on drought monitoring assessment. I think if you look at the makeup of the committee, this group was not going to go through the work that has to be done on a weekly basis to evaluate drought conditions. And so the drought monitoring subcommittee, which is made up of people that are experts at evaluating drought, we get information from the drought impacts reporter. The public has a way to weigh in on what conditions are like, and it's a more efficient process. And so certainly, this committee serves as the glue, if you will, with those executive branch agencies and the governor's office and DES. But in terms of authority for declaring drought or for declaring drought emergencies, that still resides very clearly with DES. So let's look at in your handout. They have we have the statute, and I think it's instructive to actually look at the statute in terms of what it says. This committee will or won't do. Certainly that subsection 3 goes through it in detail in terms of what the committee shall do. And number 3A, number 2 is really talks about how it's organized. But in terms of those duties, the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee shall, and it goes into one of them is develop a drought plan, which is what we're doing right now, that considers drought flooding mitigation and response. I guess that I should note that the flooding was added in 2013. And that was really added in response to the floods of 2011. While we have had presentations on the potential for flooding typically yearly, that's been provided by operations, by DNRC operations and FEMA, it became clear pretty early on that there is a whole subset of both the state and the federal government that is devoted to flooding. And a big part of that is DNRC operations and our whole floodplain division, National Weather Service and its flood hazard work that they do, certainly FEMA and disaster and emergency services, much of their work is devoted to flooding. So that the idea that we would suddenly subsume all of that within the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee didn't go very far. And it was like, wait a second, why are we going to replicate what is already happening and happening pretty effectively? And so I think it's safe to say that probably in terms of the work of this group, they've not taken on the flooding. Maybe if you were to go and look at the statute in the way that we should have, but there's a reason for that. And the reason is that flooding is something that is certainly addressed from multiple agencies and multiple entities already. And so as we go down through number 3 in the statute, it lays out what the work of this committee should be. I think if you look at both E and F, which are upon assisted organizing local advisory committees for areas identified under subsection 3D, request state agency staff to provide technical assistance to local advisory committees. I think part of this, you need to go back to 1991 when this bill was passed, was really, believe it or not, it was before the days of watershed groups. Watershed groups were only just kind of forming and taking off. Certainly the Clark Fork Task Force was one of the early ones that was also formed in 1991. And so as a result, it was anticipated that we'd have these local drought advisory committees organized through the counties, and this group would filter information through them. But the local drought advisory committees just never took off, really anywhere in the state. And the counties kind of had their own way of doing things. It was driven more by their local, their county floodplain coordinators. There was just this disconnect that never really worked. And so as a result, the watershed groups and committees kind of really took on that role. And we still provide. And so I think that request state agency staff to provide technical assistance to local drought advisory committees. I think that probably the substitute there is going to be your watershed groups and probably conservation districts. I mean, we work with a variety of groups around the state to provide those services, whereas the statute had envisioned that there would be these formal local drought advisory committees. And I think that part of that also is that we just don't have droughts every year. And when you don't have a drought, people aren't that interested. And suddenly you lose that capacity and that interest. It just didn't work. And so that was substituted by these other groups. You know, in 20, so what, let's see, was it 2013 that, in 2021 was the addition of the stream gauge working group. That portion of the statute, which lays out the duties of the stream gauge working group on your really on subsection 6 on the next page of your handout, goes through and lays out the duties of that subcommittee. That portion of the statute will sunset in 2023, and it's actually within the statute. It lays out its replacement. That will happen automatically on 2023 because they have set forth that sunset date.
Well, that's, yeah. I mean, I think what part of the recommendations, I believe, from the stream gauge oversight work group is to continue.
Right.
So
and
depending on how the legislature
correct
responds or adopts that recommendation.
Right. That will require proactive legislative action versus right now that portion of the statute is set to sunset. So I think that you know, and if you get down to subsection 8, it very clearly says that nothing in this section is intended to remove or interfere with the duties and responsibilities of the governor or the Division of Disaster and Emergency Services for disaster coordination and emergency response. It was really clearly envisioned within this legislation that this is an advisory group. And in fact, this group doesn't even have the authority to declare a drought emergency. We work quite closely with the disaster and emergency services. But they hold that they have that authority to make that recommendation to the governor's office. And that in fact is how it works. And for the last couple of drought declarations, it has worked exactly that way, in that disaster and emergency services carries that and works closely with the governor's office to make that disaster drought emergency or drought disaster declaration. And so I think that part of what we wanted to get to here was some of the questions for the committee in terms of what is the role of DWSAC, and maybe it's well captured within the context of the statute today, or I think that, should the role of DWSAC go beyond an advisory role to one that's more proactive and deliberate, and if so, what does that look like? I think the second question that I put up there falls in line with that, and maybe I think that's part of the conversation as well. And that Montana doesn't have a drought management program like a whole variety of states. And so is it time to create that program with a funding source? What does that look, what does that look like? And create a formal drought management program that's overseen by this group, and that has funding, whether that funding is for monitoring, whether that funding is for producer or stakeholder relief. That can look a lot of different ways. And I think for the other two questions really go to who's at the table. It's been pointed out a number of times that DPHHS is not at the table, and certainly with all of the concerns and the impacts from drought on human health, in terms of coordinating the work that DPHS does with the other executive branch agencies, that there's probably a role there for them to play. But yet they're not at the table. And so I think that leads to the other question: are there other partners, whether they be the Montana Climate Office, for example, is not part of the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee. In most other states, they are. And so I think that there's that question of that there are other partners that we work with and rely upon, should they have a formal seat at the table. So I think there's a number of other questions that going through that we came up with, too many to address today. This is probably too many to address today, but at least maybe we can start that conversation. And I guess, Sean, I'll hand that over to you.
Yeah, really appreciate the overview, the history and the reflections on the statutory language and where it came. And then what we might do as a committee thinking about that, to me, it squares nicely with the overview that Sarah provided at the beginning of the different plan components. And just a little bit of editorializing from me perhaps, but in the statutory language that you shared, Michael, a couple of things stood out to me that I think really align well with how we might think about the role of this committee with respect to the plan, the drought plan update at the same time. And that's on sub 6, where it talks about really the potential for drought or water supply to cause adverse impacts to human health and safety, environmental quality, or both. And so I think what we're really seeing from members of the committee and members of the public, our stakeholder working groups, is that they're really helping us identify what those likely adverse impacts might look like across the board. And then if we go back to the role of the committee and the duties under sub 3G in particular, what ideas and activities might we consider that will reduce our vulnerability to some of those impacts? And I feel like that's the conversation we want to have. As we're having that, there are different pieces to think about, and those again map back to our plan components, where we probably do want to think, as we were talking about during the first hour and a half, around our monitoring services. What do we know and not know? What are we seeing happening on the ground? And we're learning a lot about where we have those vulnerabilities right now through the interviews and additional assessment that's going on, that's ongoing, as well as the survey that's forthcoming. This to me feels like it's within that operational administrative framework. What is the role of our different agencies? What is the role of this committee? Who needs to be a part of the conversations in order to inform and advance the conversations and help us create these actions and strategies? So just in my own thinking, it was helpful to have that overview of what the statute provides, but then as we have this opportunity to review and update the drought plan, where might this conversation fit within that broader framework? So any, I don't know, questions or thoughts from committee members about either response to the questions posed here by Michael, or just how we might think about the role of this committee? Stephen?
I think it generally, as we just, I've had some time in my career and most recently dealing with our analysis, basin by basin in terms of drought response and making call and whatnot. The one area that really is highlighted here and in those efforts is the real lack of engagement, development of local drought response plans. We do have a number of, but it really is a handful of communities who have put pen to paper and actually developed a formalized drought response plan. But there are several that, we deal with when we're, looking at making a call, who either are reluctant to deal with, specifically, water quantity type issues, or, it's just not their role, not their objective, not in their mission to deal with those. And so I know that we talked about it a lot, and, it's kind of, how do we get to a point where we are really encouraging that type of discussion and engagement within these communities on becoming more drought resilient? You're right, Michael, as far as when these committees get together, and when there's interest, it's during a drought, but it really falls off if there isn't a drought. And we just, I think it's inherent upon either, this committee, the agencies around this table to really come up with a comprehensive effort to engage local watershed groups and conservation districts to that end.
Great. Thanks for that comment, Stephen. And I just from my perspective, add that as we've been having the conversations the last several months, just that diversity across the state has been such a feature that's been highlighted that requires to think at both the local scale and the state scale. And the opportunity maybe we have is to think about, well, if the role is to support the organization and coordination of those bodies so that we can have that place-based response, what can we provide in terms of additional clarity, recommendations, insights, best practices to support those, to help not just that local community, but to coordinate that at the statewide level. Eric?
Yeah, so just to build off what Stephen's saying, our programs at DEQ and the Water Quality Planning Bureau, we work with those local groups and more on the water quality side. That's DEQ's role, but obviously, I think it's those local groups that bring those things together. I think bringing water supply, availability, and water quality, that's within their purview to do, as well as, fishery stuff. Within our program, the non-point source and wetlands program, we provide, technical support to those groups. First, on watershed restoration plans, it's a requirement for accessing funding that we have through EPA. And I think a lot of groups are bringing those, water quality, water quantity issues together. And what we've done, just as a program, is really emphasize this idea of restoring these natural processes. Obviously, that means flooding, restoring floodplain access to those areas, creating this natural water storage. You know, and a lot of the projects that we do work with and we have funded, you know, are addressing sediment as a primary pollutant, getting sediment reductions, but we don't have the funding to demonstrate the late season recharge that those projects are having. There are some projects, Trout Unlimited in particular on 9 Mile Creek, was able to fund a study showing up to, you know, half a CFS late season return from that early, you know, recharging the floodplain, having those late season returns. And I think as those projects mature, you know, like getting more, you know, habitat, more beavers moving in, you're seeing a lot more storage in those areas. We're just not able to demonstrate that on a lot of projects. We don't have the funding to demonstrate that. And then, you know, just building off that, we're actually working with DNRC, the CARD program, to put in an application for the implementation part of the America the Beautiful funding, and really bringing in some of those projects that have come in that, you know, have that momentum showing those water quality benefits and, you know, water quality improvements. 9 Mile Creek, some work on Nevada Creek, work down in Lower Gallatin on Dry Creek, and, you know, some others that are like that. But how to really tie those together, I think, to build momentum. And I think, you know, a lot of it is funding. Like you said, how do we support those groups? And it's a matter of money, but there's more money going into this stuff right now than we've seen in a long time. You know, that America the Beautiful challenge, but just stuff coming through the bipartisan infrastructure law and that federal emphasis on climate mitigation that we're seeing. So I think there is a lot of opportunity as far as the role of this group. I mean, providing some of that just support for, you know, I don't know if it's moving forward on, you know, additional legislation or just getting more money to go to these things. I think, you know, over time we built a lot of the, you know, a lot of these, like you said, watershed groups weren't around. I think they're a lot higher capacity now. And we've started building that like local governance infrastructure to help support a lot of this work to happen. So
yeah, I think that's and it almost seems as though, because you're right, I think there are a lot of funding opportunities or a lot of grant programs out there that we have available to folks. You know, they're also really highly competitive as well, right? And so you have a lot of interest, you have limited resources, you know, to match that interest. But it also is the bigger question of how do we determine, you know, what they need in order to kind of move in those directions. I mean, we have these programs. I mean, is there something this group that could put together that it could be a easy reference or resource that might be able to assist those folks?
Yeah, really appreciate the conversation. A lot of great programs out there. It feels like a lot of it is just how do we take stock of what we already have, make sure that it's well coordinated, that people understand what those resources do for them and how to access them, but also maybe take some time to put together a resource guide or to highlight a couple of best practices or case studies that exemplify the kind of outcomes that we're looking for. It seems like there's lots of good conversation. Ian, did you want to?
I just think agriculture kind of has always viewed this group as an information clearinghouse for sure. And so historically, our role has been, you know, providing that crop condition report through our Montana Wheat Barley Committee, which has a network of growers on the ground in districts statewide, which essentially ground truths, you know, what all of the drought monitor reports are saying. And so that weekly crop condition report during the growing season is basically the information that we feed back into the group. And it's largely been replaced, I think, by the drought impact reporter, and we do our best to try and get those same reports into the drought impact reporter. But that's been our biggest role, I think, is providing you know, on the ground crop conditions from our network of growers, through our producer groups, through our Montana Wheat Barley Committee. And then I would say the other piece, you know, we collect assessments from producers. We award those assessments largely to Montana State University Extension without a specific direction to focus on drought. But the reality of production agriculture in Montana, it being dependent highly on precipitation, is that a lot of those projects fund drought tolerance, drought resiliency crops. And so there's no specific charge there, but the reality that a lot of that research that gets done is with drought in mind. And so that's by those committee members making decisions, funding decisions based on the reality of the situation on the ground. So we do some of that with those dollars intentionally, but not with specific backing behind it. And so, and then the only other comment, I guess, and I've said this before, the producer comment that we keep hearing is kind of about supply and storage, right? They want to see some consideration in the plan for increasing supply and storage. And obviously, I'm not a water guy, but I know that's a complicated question, complicated ask, and lots of parties involved. But that's consistently what we keep hearing. Is they want producers want to see increased storage and water availability.
That's good. Anna.
Yeah, I want to hit on kind of everything everyone's already said, but maybe add a little bit to it. I think, and I agree with you, Ian, I think we do a great job of information exchanging here. I love the presentations by the monitoring subcommittee and kind of the data. I know that the public really responds well to that. I think I'd like this whole group to take the next step. And when I look at the statutory requirements, we talk about implementing the state plan, not just drafting it, but how we're going to implement it. How do we mitigate for drought and flooding? How do we reduce vulnerabilities? And when I think about those words and that guidance, I think that's the opportunity for us to move on. And so when I think about information exchange, what I loved about USGS presentation is kind of that recommendations and needs to do this mission better. What else do we need in terms of information so that we can mitigate, so that we can prepare? In addition, Michael, you asked, well, what is the role of this committee? So we have this monitoring subcommittee, we have DWSAC that kind of shares information to the public, and then we have DES and the governor's office. Well, what is that intersection between this group and a drought declaration? We talked about triggers and what that looks like. I think this group could come up with a recommendation on triggers and outcomes that we want to see happen. And I see that as an opportunity for us to go deeper. When you talk about kind of the proactive measures and how do we support local planning, 100%. But what does that look like? How do we implement those plans? What does statewide coordination look like? I agree there's a lot of resources at the table, but sometimes they're just the BIL, or they're one-off grants that only support certain sectors of water users. It doesn't affect the whole suite of water users in terms of conservation, recreation, municipalities. And I would really love to see the gap analysis that RESPECT does and that the DNRC comes forward with, to think about how do we fill in those gaps of resources. Other states have state-based funding for resources that are needed to respond to drought. And I'd love for us to holistically think about the different sectors of water users and what state-based resources might be needed so that we can holistically respond to drought. And then finally, I was just thinking about sustained implementation. I love that we're developing the plan, and I hope the plan really thinks about that sustained implementation across sectors around drought. And resources is a piece of that, but policy changes, someone said increased storage. What are those policy changes that we need to really start contemplating across all sectors of water users? So I really love, Sarah, what you said about let's have a work session. I love the high level conversation we were having. I think some of the impact and the results from RESPECT and kind of all of our agencies coming together will really give us the space to have a work session to really talk about additional resources, talk about additional policies, and talk about the relationship and the role of the DWSAC moving forward. Those are my thoughts.
Appreciate that, Anna. And I guess just a quick follow-up on that and reflecting back on the questions that Michael asked. It feels like, to me, that feels like a great opportunity to grow into that next step, but it also feels like it takes additional capacity, and we've got really busy folks here around the table. And so one of the questions that Michael asked was, do we need to think about some sort of drought management program or some other way that's another mechanism to continue to focus resources and capacity on these issues and do the coordination and thinking. And so whether it's you or to the committee as a whole, is that something that you feel like is possible under the existing structure and charge of DWSAC, or would additional capacity in some sort of program such as a state drought management or monitoring program be useful?
I think if it depends on if we're taking on implementation, mitigation, coordination of resources, coordination of policy. I really think it depends on what the recommendations are for the plan. I think they'll drive what resources are needed. A program just to have a program, no. But if we're serious about mitigating and adapting and supporting communities on drought, and there's specific recommendations and resources that are needed in policies, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess what I was hearing was a little bit of a difference between an advisory committee and a clearinghouse, and then a program that might implement and sustain a plan over time. I know we've got a couple of folks who were with us online earlier, so Cody Ferguson from Commerce or Mike Honeycutt from Livestock, if you guys are still on and want to just share any thoughts from your perspective as task force members.
Yeah, and Mike, I know, had to jump
I think
off.
Mike had to go, yeah.
No,
Cody, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with everything that's being said. I mean, one thing we're thinking about is, this question of resilience and where it is that commerce can have the greatest impact in that. And so one of it, of course, is a response to drought and, helping to provide information to people that might visit the state or giving them alternatives. I know we've talked about that, but the other side of it then is just thinking about economic diversification and how we can work, with communities to help encourage development that isn't, that's more resilient to, drought conditions. And so I like the idea of working more closely with communities to try to do kind of localized plans. I thought that was a great point. Yeah, as much as we can start working in drought resilience into community planning, I think we should continue that conversation. I've already talked with folks at DNRC a little bit about that, but as we start looking forward and the kind of planning that we support through technical assistance or through funding for communities, I think we need to take a much harder look at drought and water resources than we have. So, yeah.
Thanks for jumping in, Cody. Appreciate those additional thoughts. And just going back to what Anna shared, I think it really does depend on what it is that we're asking the committee to do. What is that underlying purpose? And I think, to me, a lot of the conversation that we started today and the questions that Michael posed are food for thought as we build out the administrative framework for the drought management plan, and probably aren't something that we can fully answer today because it's something that we won't know until we get there. But it does start to build a bridge to some of the gaps that DNRC staff started to identify for us on page 3 of the handout when we look at those examples of state level drought management gaps. And in particular, looking at the first one under adaptation there, we're looking for this idea of thinking about, well, what are those additional resources we might bring forward for local drought management planning and processes? That was the first thing Stephen brought forward, and was really built on that as something that really resonated with people. I like how Cody was thinking about it, not just in terms of what we might historically think about in terms of water resource management, but also sustainable community building and community planning, as well as the economic impacts and economic diversification that we might build into our system processes. So as we move forward and as we think about continuing to build out our understanding of where there might be some gaps that turn into recommendations and look ahead to a future work plan session, the kind of information that's presented here on page 3 is really what we're looking for, both within and across our agencies and with our stakeholders at the local and regional level as well. Where are those opportunities to build in additional adaptations to help think about our governance, our resourcing, our resilience, so that we can better understand and address impacts? And what does that look like at a response level? So just looking at the clock here, we've got just about 10 minutes left today. And so I want to turn to some of these additional gaps that people might want to just throw out there for us to at least flag now and build out for additional conversation between now and our next meeting. And for this, I'll start again with our task force members, but then turn to those who are joining us online and the broader community to see if there's any gaps or emerging adaptation or response strategies that you'd want us to consider. So starting first with task force members, is there anything on this page that resonated with you or additional ideas that you'd like to just put forth right now?
Are there any of these existing local drought advisory committees? And is there one that's like a gold star better than any other one?
No, there are, there's kind of an emergency. What's the one out of, was it?
Yeah, local emergency planning committees have in
Right.
some cases taken on drought. I think Carbon County was interested recently. I would say, I think we've discussed this, but for the most part, it's like watershed groups and CDs and these maybe local emergency planning committees that have taken on that role.
But nothing that exists exactly as
No.
contemplated in statute.
No, I would say nothing that exists even remotely like what was contemplated in statute.
And we do have we're compiling a spreadsheet of like watershed level drought plans that exist in Montana, just to see who's doing what and what they've done in terms of which sections and resources they have. So that could be helpful, but
Thanks for the question. And I think compiling those local plans, a good place to start, and then we can look for gaps or opportunities to build upon them.
Yeah, that local planning effort has all been driven by either the CDs or local watershed groups.
And Megan, I know you've been talking to a lot of people, so also welcome your thoughts here on anything that you might want to just highlight that's either on this page or other gaps that you're hearing in conversation with folks.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think this page is a really good summary of what I have been hearing. I mean, primarily with funding, there's funding available for long-term planning for adaptation. And it's often through different kind of specific programs that different agencies have, that are related to drought, but not necessarily specific to drought. And then I think that one issue that with getting that local planning done is that sometimes local groups don't have the capacity to be able to do that. And so to help build that bridge with providing capacity for those local groups to help to sort of bolster that planning. And that's for the longer term. The shorter term, the responses are very much tied to that emergency declaration or the funding to be able to respond quickly, and more so directed towards agriculture, some through small business. And then thinking about like guides and the tourism side of things, there seems to be a gap there. And then, one thing that has come up a lot in conversations too is the idea of is that education and outreach, and there's a lot that's being done like agriculture, for example, and livestock, for example, that's being done to your constituents. And so there's like the choir knows where to go get information, but the public maybe we don't appear to have a very educated public around water conservation and water awareness in general. And so if we're asking people, if we get to a point where these local plans ask people to behave differently or potentially make a difficult choice, that will go a lot further with folks that understand why they're being asked. So those are the key things that we're looking at. That modeling, or the statewide modeling that we talked, storage is something that's come up as a potential. Any folks who are wanting more storage, we see that our natural storage, the snowpack, that's shifting, and it's not as real. It will look different in 50 years than it does now, for sure. And raising that water table is something that's come up, that groundwater storage. And for that, having the baseline data and modeling is pretty critical. So those are the things that have come up. And it's, they're on this. Most of it are captured right.
Great, thanks for that, Megan. It's nice to hear how those are grounded in the conversations that you've been having and highlighted on the sheet here. Also thinking just about that emergency response piece and how, even as we're thinking about proactive planning, in many cases, we want to make sure that we're using our existing resources and declaration processes and improving those as much as we can.
And I think that helps us, I mean, with the idea that we talked about triggers last time, you know, and how what we, whether that's through a recommendation to the monitoring subcommittee or if it's more formalized, but that sort of drives home the importance of that. If the response funding is tied to a declaration, getting that declaration is pretty important to be able to get folks relief.
And that's a real challenge, right? People are feeling the pain a lot further or much before they get any relief, you know, whatsoever for that, right? And I don't know how best, you know, to address that. I mean, I think the forecasting, the monitoring, you know, with the efforts of the monitoring subgroup, I think has done, you know, quite a bit in terms of timely information in terms of how the drought is progressing, you know, where those updates are happening on like a weekly basis, and that's key. But you know, in terms of, you know, we've heard it, you know, from Mike Honeycutt and Ian, as far as producers go, you know, just people are feeling the pain, you know, and they're just not getting, you know, relief until months afterwards. So how do we figure out how to adopt, you know, or get folks to kind of look at these, you know, various strategies so that they're not feeling that pain as, you know, much, that they can, you know, with some strategies that they can apply, look, you know, on their various operations, you know, and funding to support those strategies that they can manage. You know, I mean, drought will happen, but you know, do they have to feel the pain that they, you know, may currently be feeling, or can that be mitigated, and to what level can we do that?
And I think, and that goes to the whole adaptation and resilience piece that we're hope to identify within this new drought plan. And so that suddenly then you've got the underpinnings for what this committee, you know, can do in terms of drought plan implementation, which is spelled out in statute. And so I think that that's kind of getting to the crux of where this committee might go in terms of, you know, kind of changing its role from what it has been historically.
I would say that this gap analysis is excellent, and we've talked about a lot on resources and additional resources needs. I think that captures this really well. I think what I would add to this list and for further discussion is the kind of the suite of other tools in terms of policy changes, incentive, and regulatory relief. Resources and education are hit upon here, but those other things, I think we should spend some time thinking about.
Great. Appreciate those additions. Any other additions that you guys would want to add to this emerging list of gaps? Just wanted to reflect on something Stephen shared too, which seemed to really reflect back on, sorry, we're having camera issues here. Reflect back on this idea, at least in my mind, that we talked earlier about how hard it is sometimes to plan for drought because we don't necessarily think about it until it's here, and then it's acute, and then it's a crisis, and you're really relying on emergency services. But if we can think ahead and build in policies, tools, plans, and programs that can address those ahead of time and build in resilience and just to increase the long-term viability of our community, our citizens, our producers, our small businesses, that we'll be on the right track. And to that end, it's going to take, you know, us listening to the people who are impacted by drought. And I think there's a lot of folks online today that have been listening in and thinking about how, you know, what is it that you need from the DWSAC and Drought Task Force as we move forward. And I'd love to have you guys be active participants and continuing to share your needs, your insights. What is it this committee can do to help address its statutory obligations, but also meet your needs moving forward? And how can you help inform this process? So I know we're coming up at the end of our time today, but if you have any quick thoughts on either of those topics, either something related to DWSAC and its roles and responsibilities, or anything that you would like to add to the gap analysis or gaps that have been identified on page 3 of the handout, love to have you just spend a minute or two dropping those into the chat box. And then certainly if there are any questions that people want to bring forward before we jump off, just make a couple of minutes for that. So any questions from our online viewers? All right, and I apologize for taking the whole time with the discussion. It was really rich there towards the end, getting a lot of good discussion around both the role of the committee as well as where we might focus our time and attention moving forward. And I think in terms of next steps, that's what the DNRC water planning staff and myself will be working on with the committee members to make sure that we can carry the information you've shared with us today forward and put that into a format and plan that continues the conversation so that we can build out all these different plan components, but also meet your needs and interests. So really appreciate everyone's time and contributions today. Really good progress in not just understanding what's happening out there, but how we can work together to build a more proactive and comprehensive drought plan for the state moving forward. So thank you all for your time, and we look forward to seeing you at the next meeting, which is in August. And all of that information will be continue to be posted online at mtdroughtinfo.org.
What's the next meeting date? August 3rd.
Thanks, Anna. August 3rd.